Hello people of the internet, my name is CJ, and today we will be diving into one of the most interesting battles of the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Rhode Island. In the latter part of 1776, a British army arrived at Newport, Rhode Island, and began setting up a base there. After about a year and a half of this occupation, the Continental Army, along with their new allies, the French, devised a plan to recapture Newport from the British.
On the 29th of July, 1778, a French fleet arrived in Narragansett Bay. Seeing this, the British troops who had occupied the island, then known as Rhode Island, since 1776, spent the next several days fortifying their positions and consolidating their forces. During this time, the British commander, Major General Pigot, ordered the abandonment of multiple batteries and fortifications on other islands because he was afraid that the French fleet would be able to cut off communication between those batteries and the main British base at Newport. About this same time, between the 30th of July and the 5th of August, the Royal Navy destroyed several of its ships to prevent their being captured by the French. The crews of these ships were then put to work on artillery batteries in Newport and the surrounding areas. On the 8th of August, the French fleet began a bombardment of the remaining British batteries, which was to little effect as those batteries had been previously strengthened with additional fortifications. On the morning of the 9th, a British fleet under the command of Admiral Richard Howe arrived. Seeing this, the French fleet sailed out of Newport Harbor to meet them. As the two fleets faced each other, a large storm arrived, causing severe damage to both of them and, significantly, forcing the French to sail to Boston for repairs. Also on the 9th of August, the Continental Army, under the command of Major General John Sullivan, crossed over from the mainland to Rhode Island itself, landing at a place called Howland's Ferry. The Continentals first took up positions at the recently abandoned British works on Windmill Hill at the north of the island, before advancing south to Honeyman's Hill a few days later. In response to the Continentals taking a position so close to his own, General Pigot ordered the construction of an additional fortification directly opposing the rebel force. Responding to the construction of this British fortification, the Continentals built an artillery battery at their position on Honeyman's Hill. The construction of this battery was soon followed by that of a second one, and by the 19th of August, there was a regular exchanging of artillery fire between the British and American lines. Due to the threat posed by the enemy artillery, General Pigot withdrew his encampment further south to behind Tonomy Hill, and ordered the construction of an additional line of fortifications and a new artillery battery. The artillery fire being exchanged between the British and Continental lines continued without intermission for several days. Finally, on the 27th of August, 3 British warships arrived, bringing news that there would soon be an army of 3,500 troops sailing from New York to reinforce the Newport garrison. Hearing of this news, and displeased that the French fleet had not yet returned from Boston, General Sullivan decided to begin slowly evacuating his troops from the island. This began with sending the heavy artillery and other supplies back to the mainland, as well as sending troops to man the fortifications on the north of the island to cover the retreat, if necessary.
On the 28th, the Continental commanders determined that their best course of action would be to fall back to the north of the island, and there await news as to whether the French fleet would be returning from Boston anytime soon.
Between the evening of the 28th and the early morning of the 29th, the Continental Army fell back to the fortifications on Windmill Hill. Later on the morning of the 29th, the British artillery opened fire on the Continental lines as they normally would, only to find that the Continentals did not return their fire. Upon learning that the Continentals had abandoned their works, General Pigot sent forward several regiments, quote, in order, if possible, to annoy them in their retreat. These troops were divided into two columns. One, consisting of the British troops, was commanded by Brigadier General Francis Smith, and the other, consisting of the German troops, was commanded by Major General Malsburg. As they advanced north, Brigadier General Smith's column encountered the Continental Light Infantry on Quaker Hill. Hearing that the battle had begun, General Pigot sent a combined force of British regulars, Germans, and Loyalists to reinforce Smith's position. By the time they arrived, however, General Sullivan had ordered the Continental Light Infantry to retreat to Windmill Hill, and Quaker Hill was firmly in British possession. As this was going on, Major General Malsburg's column was advancing north along the west side of the island. During this advance, the Germans encountered a series of continental fortifications which, with the assistance of a large force of Loyalists, they were able to capture. After pushing back a force of Continental Light Dragoons, the Germans found themselves on top of Turkey Hill. After being resupplied with ammunition, the Germans attempted to continue their advance up Barrington's Hill, but faced strong resistance from the 1st Rhode Island Regiment. This was among the first regiments in the Continental Army to allow African Americans to serve. Many of the men of the 1st Rhode Island had been slaves who had enlisted to fight in exchange for their freedom. The Battle of Rhode Island was the first engagement which the 1st Rhode Island Regiment was involved in. In all, the British force advanced 3 times toward the Continental fortifications on Windmill Hill. On the 3rd attempt, with the assistance of a naval cannonade, they nearly succeeded, but were once again pushed back. This engagement, which, according to General Sullivan, lasted nearly an hour, resulted in the British and German troops falling back to the top of a hill, from which they could easily repel any attacks from the Continental forces. On the evening of the 29th, the Continental forces returned to their fortifications on Windmill Hill, while the British and Germans fortified the ground on which they stood. The next morning, General Sullivan received word that the French fleet would not be able to return anytime soon. Because of this, and the news that a new British fleet was not far from Newport, General Sullivan decided to call a council of the Continental officers. The outcome of this meeting is recorded in a letter that General Sullivan wrote to the Continental Congress the next day. As we could have no prospect of operating against Newport with success without the assistance of a fleet, it was unanimously agreed to quit the island until the return of the French squadron. By the very early morning of the 31st of August, 1778, all Continental forces had been ferried off of Rhode Island. The island would remain firmly in British control for nearly another year. In his return after the battle, General Sullivan recorded the Continental casualties as 211 killed, wounded, and missing. In General Pigot's return, the British casualties are listed as 1 captain, 1 volunteer, 4 sergeants, 31 rank and file, 1 driver killed, 2 captains, 5 lieutenants, 7 ensigns, 13 sergeants, 1 drummer, 180 rank and file, 2 drivers wounded, 1 lieutenant, 1 sergeant, 10 rank and file missing. The Battle of Rhode Island was over.